Stop whatever you are doing and face this cold reality squarely. 70 million Americans have just woken up to an existential risk that no morning news bulletin has dared to name correctly. This is not a forecast for the year 2034. This is not a hypothetical political debate about the trust fund running dry. This is a structural malfunction occurring right now, threatening the ability of your Social Security check to appear in your bank account on the appointed day. We must perform immediate semantic surgery on the phrase might not arrive. To understand the true danger, we are compelled to bifurcate two concepts that the public often confuses as one: insolvency risk and process risk. For the past 4 decades, since the 1983 reforms of the Greenspan Commission, the perennial fear of senior Americans has been tethered to insolvency risk. That is the fear that Congress will fail, that the national coffers will be empty, and that the government will simply lack the funds to pay. But ladies and gentlemen, that is not what we are discussing today. Your money is there. Legally, your entitlements are inviolate. The U.S. Treasury retains sufficient liquidity. However, an entirely different beast has emerged from the shadows of bureaucracy: process risk. Imagine the Social Security system as a vast reservoir. For years, we worried the reservoir would run dry. But this new risk is not a lack of water. It is that the pipes leading from the reservoir to your kitchen tap are becoming clogged by technical potholes and newly erected security barricades. We are speaking of an unprecedented type of technical friction. This is the collision between modern anti-fraud algorithms and the Social Security Administration's SSA antiquated mainframe architecture. When the SSA implements new identity verification protocols, or when banks tighten anti-money laundering controls, your check does not vanish because the government is broke. It is suspended in digital limbo because of a computer-generated red flag. You may have heard of thousands of accounts being frozen due to suspected fraud, or the transition to ID.me causing insurmountable access barriers for the non-tech savvy. That is the shape of the new risk. This distinction is vital. If the problem is insolvency, you need an act of Congress for rescue. But if the problem is process, you are facing a solitary battle against a faceless machine, where a phone appeal can take hours, if not weeks, to resolve. For a retiree living check to pay rent or buy medication, the delay caused by this technical friction is as devastating as a benefit cut. A check that arrives 10 days late due to a system error inflicts the same financial ruin as a check that never arrives. Legal security becomes meaningless if the liquidity flow is arrested by administrative sclerosis. And this is merely the surface of the issue. Beneath this friction lies a far more silent but aggressive policy shift regarding how the SSA handles overpayments. Is this procedural risk merely the precursor to a massive clawback campaign of which you are entirely unaware? Legal safety becomes meaningless if the circulation of currency is halted by the sclerosis of administrative procedure. And this is merely the outer shell of the issue. We must pull back the velvet curtain of false security to peer into the machinery operating beneath, the banking system. For decades, the relationship between the Social Security Administration, SSA, and your bank was a straight line, a simple deposit, a digital handshake. But today, that relationship has mutated into a labyrinth of security checkpoints. When we speak of 70 million Americans waking up to a new risk, we are not speaking of the collapse of the Treasury, but of the clogging of the pipes. Banks, under suffocating pressure from regulators regarding anti-money laundering and identity fraud, have quietly shifted their role from passive custodians to active gatekeepers. This is where the algorithm begins to intervene in human life. Identity verification and know your customer, KYC protocols, are no longer static procedures. They have become living entities, scanning continuously in real time. The problem lies here. Modern security algorithms are designed with a suspect first, verify later mindset. A slight shift in metadata, such as an unusual login IP address, a minor discrepancy in the beneficiary's name spelling between SSA records and bank records, or even a routine software update of the automated clearinghouse ACH system, can trigger what the technical world calls a red flag. When this flag is raised, the system does not merely send a warning, it freezes the transaction. Your Social Security check does not vanish. It is thrust into a state I call digital purgatory, a status of pending review. And this is where the tragedy of modernization reveals itself. The speed of the algorithm far outpaces human processing capacity. Millions of transactions can be flagged in a nanosecond by AI, yet the number of compliance officers available to manually resolve these flags has not increased commensurately. We are witnessing a classic bottleneck. Technology generates suspicion on an industrial scale, but exoneration is performed on an artisanal scale. The survival funds of millions of seniors are trapped in the narrow fissure between excessive security and severe personnel shortages. The intent of these protocols, in theory, is to shield citizens' assets from cyber criminals. But ironically, in the effort to protect the house from burglars, the banking system appears to have bolted the doors and locked the homeowner out as well. This friction is not a bug, it is a feature of the new system. However, if you believe this delay is the nadir, you have underestimated the complexity of bureaucracy. Beneath this technical friction lies a policy shift far more silent, yet drastic, regarding how the SSA handles overpayments. A variable we shall dissect next, where the arithmetic of debt may make the current delays look like a mercy. While the specter of overpayments, that bureaucratic euphemism for clawing back funds, looms large over millions of households, it is essentially merely a single variable in a far more complex risk equation. We must take a step back to contemplate the colossal figure sitting at the eye of the storm. 70 million? In the abstract calculus of Washington, numbers often lose their actual weight, becoming mere soulless data points on a congressional ledger. But pause for a moment to grasp the sheer gravity of this figure. 70 million is not merely a segment of the population. For all intents and purposes, it is a nation within a nation. This figure exceeds the total population of the United Kingdom, is larger than France, and is double the population of Canada. When we speak of 70 million people waking up to a new risk, we are not discussing a minor administrative hiccup. We are discussing the livelihood stability of 1 in every 5 Americans who depend on this financial stream. This is precisely where the concept of concentration risk becomes critically important and deeply unsettling. Imagine the entire hydraulic pressure of the American social safety net being forced through a singular digital aperture. It is no coincidence that financial experts view the Social Security Administration, SSA, not merely as a welfare agency, but as a massive, monolithic payment ecosystem. The danger lies in this very uniformity. When you have a highly centralized system serving 1/5 of the population, you have inadvertently eliminated the diversity that helps mitigate risk. If these 70 million people received income from 70 million different sources, a technical failure would be a personal tragedy. But when everyone shares a single infrastructure, a single identity verification process, and a single distribution mechanism, a small change in an operational variable, such as the implementation of a new security protocol or a change in an inflation calculation algorithm, will create a ripple effect with unforeseeable destructive power. Skeptics might argue, surely the entire system won't crash at once. Technically, they might be correct, yet they are profoundly mistaken in that complacency. Why? Because at this scale, a small probability multiplied by a massive denominator yields catastrophic consequences. Let us assume the system operates smoothly 99% of the time, a success rate any private corporation would envy. But if a mere 1% of these transactions encounter the friction we discussed, a software glitch, a frozen verification loop, or a hold order due to suspected fraud, we are looking at 700,000 individuals, 700,000 seniors, disabled persons, and widows suddenly cut off from their lifeline. Visualize a city the size of Boston or Washington, D.C., suddenly having its financial plug pulled overnight. That is no longer a technical issue. That is a potential humanitarian crisis right in the heart of America. Furthermore, this risk does not stop at the beneficiary's mailbox or bank account. We must speak of the velocity of money. These Social Security checks rarely sit under mattresses. They are immediately injected into the local economy. They pay for grocery stores, pharmacies, rent, and essential services. When this payment ecosystem clogs, even if locally or temporarily, it creates a deflationary shock that transmits through local communities where profit margins are already razor thin. Reliance on a single system, therefore, turns the SSA into a single point of failure for the American consumer economy. But is this fragility accidental? Or is it the inevitable consequence of an obsolete architecture trying to shoulder the demands of the 21st century? To answer this, we are forced to look at the actual brain steering this titanic vessel, and what we find inside the ancient lines of code may be even more worrying than the debt figures themselves. But is this fragility accidental, or is it the inevitable consequence of an obsolete architecture trying to shoulder the demands of the 21st century? To answer this, we are forced to look at the actual brain steering this titanic vessel, and what we find inside the ancient lines of code may be even more worrying than the debt figures themselves. We are witnessing a phenomenon I term institutional friction. A slow-motion yet devastating collision between two colossal gears never designed to turn at the same velocity. The bureaucratic machinery of Washington and the defensive algorithms of the modern banking system. The Social Security Administration, SSA, is by its very nature an entity of the industrial age. It operates like a factory from the 1950s. Linear, predictable, and remarkably rigid. Its payment schedules are fixed not by minutes or seconds, but by statutory cycles that have existed for decades. When the SSA hits send, it is a unilateral act, an administrative command based on the assumption that the other side, the recipient, is in a static state. However, the receiving end of this transaction, the private banking sector, inhabits a completely different reality. Since the Patriot Act and the explosion of global cybercrime, banks are no longer passive vaults. They have transformed into heavily armed digital constables operating in a state of perpetual paranoia. This is where the misalignment becomes dangerous. While the SSA operates on government time, banks operate on compliance rules that shift in real time. Visualize this scenario. An AI algorithm at Chase or Wells Fargo detects a minor anomaly in a retiree's data metadata, perhaps a strange IP address login from a vacation spot, or a slight discrepancy in digital identity records. In a microsecond, the bank's security protocol triggers a preemptive freeze. To the bank, this is a cybersecurity triumph. But to the SSA's archaic batch processing system, this is a brick wall. The government system lacks the capacity to negotiate with the bank's AI. It simply receives a rejection signal and automatically flags the payment as failed. The result? The money doesn't vanish, but it gets trapped in a bureaucratic limbo. The retiree wakes up to an empty account, not because the government is insolvent, but because the two systems protecting them are speaking mutually unintelligible languages. The SSA requires 30 days to investigate a returned payment, whereas the citizens' utility bills are due tomorrow. This friction is not a technical glitch, it is an architectural flaw. And when we scale this minor incident across 70 million transactions, we are no longer discussing inconvenience. We are discussing systemic risk. But if you think getting stuck in digital gears is the worst nightmare, brace yourself. Because looming behind this technical curtain is a far more terrifying macroeconomic variable, a liquidity trap that even the smartest algorithms cannot solve. The SSA requires 30 days to investigate a returned payment, whereas the citizens' utility bills are due tomorrow. This friction is not a technical glitch. It is an architectural flaw. And when we scale this minor incident across 70 million transactions, we are no longer discussing inconvenience. We are discussing systemic risk. But if you think getting stuck in digital gears is the worst nightmare, brace yourself, because looming behind this technical curtain is a far more terrifying macroeconomic variable, a liquidity trap that even the smartest algorithms cannot solve. In the lecture halls of economics, professors draw a sharp, cold distinction between solvency and liquidity. Solvency is whether you have enough assets to cover your debts in the long run. The United States, as a nation, remains solvent. But liquidity is a different beast altogether. Do you have the cash on hand right now at this very second to buy a quart of milk? For a retiree on a fixed income, this academic distinction is the difference between dignity and despair. Consider the scenario. The third of the month is sacred for millions of seniors. It is when the liquidity arrives. But what happens if that liquidity is delayed by 72 hours? To a hedge fund manager, 3 days is a rounding error. But to a widow in Ohio living on a $1-800 monthly check, a 3-day delay is a micro-financial catastrophe. Why? Because the modern financial architecture does not wait. Automatic debits for rent, insurance, and pharmaceuticals are programmed to sweep accounts at the dawn of the 4th. If the Social Security funds have not cleared, those payments bounce. And this is where the poverty tax strikes. bank overdraft fees, late fees from utilities, penalty rates on credit cards. By the time the government check finally arrives on the 6th, its real purchasing power has been eroded by a cascade of penalties. Technically, you haven't suffered a benefit cut. The face value remains the same, but functionally, you have become significantly poorer. This is why your anxiety is entirely rational. You are not paranoid about losing assets. You are correctly perceiving the risk of losing temporal control over your cash flow. This waiting game creates a form of psychological inflation, where the value of peace of mind depreciates by the hour. We are witnessing a shift from a guaranteed social contract to a probability of payment. And when liquidity freezes, even for a brief historical moment, faith in the dollar and the state's promise is shaken more violently than during any recession. However, this cash flow delay is not merely a matter of banking protocols or computer servers. There is another invisible hand tightening this monetary valve, a political mechanism buried deep within Congress that most Americans have forgotten, yet it is being loaded to become the most dangerous bargaining chip in modern financial history. And when liquidity freezes, even for a brief historical moment, faith in the dollar and the state's promise is shaken more violently than during any recession. However, this cash flow delay is not merely a matter of banking protocols or computer servers. There is another invisible hand tightening this monetary valve, a political mechanism buried deep within Congress that most Americans have forgotten, yet it is being loaded to become the most dangerous bargaining chip in modern financial history. Thus, we arrive at a necessary philosophical pivot, a shift from passivity to agency that every citizen, not merely Social Security beneficiaries, must undertake with immediacy. The temptation, when faced with the leviathan of federal bureaucracy and the labyrinthine complexity of banking protocols, is to retreat into a posture of learned helplessness. We tell ourselves we are merely numbers in the Social Security Administration's database, passive victims awaiting largesse from Washington. But the history of this republic was not written by passive subjects. It was written by vigilant citizens in the context of the current risk that vigilance requires not loud protests, but quiet, precise digital surveillance. The first step in shedding the role of the victim is to understand the financial plumbing. Your deposit is not teleported by magic. It moves through the automated clearinghouse ACH system, a network with specific protocols, schedules, and choke points. Do not wait for payment day to check a balance. Set up automated alerts at your bank today, not just for posted deposits, but crucially, for pending notifications. You need to know where your funds are in the digital cycle before they hit your available balance. Furthermore, diversify your reliance on a single portal. Do not rely solely on text messages. Check the My Social Security portal, cross-reference with your bank's notifications, and understand your specific financial institution's deposit processing window. A one-day delay due to a federal holiday is categorically different from a delay caused by a systemic liquidity shortage. And the ability to distinguish between the two is the antidote to panic. We inhabit an era where technological complexity is often mistaken for uncontrollable chaos. But the truth is starker. Security in the 21st century comes neither from blind faith in the smooth operation of the state apparatus, nor from panicking over sensationalist headlines. In a complex, digitized world where algorithms dictate our solvency, true security is not found in the emotional comfort of a political promise, but in the cold, hard verification of the process. We do not fear what we understand. Therefore, to conquer the anxiety of the digital age, one must stop being a spectator of their own financial destiny and become its auditor. That is the only sovereignty available in the 21st century.